Hello and welcome to another Chess Club game review. And in this game I had the black pieces. My opponent did not want to be named. So with the white pieces, they begin with knight to f3. Alright, so let's see what we can learn here. I have the analysis up. That way we can use the computer to check mistakes. And I recommend if you play through your own games, go over them without the computer first, and then, of course, use the computer to check what you missed. But since we're trying to get through this video, fairly quickly, we will just throw the analysis up and plow through the game. So knight to f3 by my opponent is the ready opening. And a lot of times the ready opening can transpose into other openings, so it's kind of a flexible first move here. I respond with d5, which is one option. If your opponent allows you to take control of the center of the board because they're not placing their pawns there, then that's usually a good idea to throw your pawns into the center and try and gain space there. So we have d3, still book moves here. Apparently, this is the ready opening old Indian attack. So I continue by developing my knight, and we're back into a regular ready opening here. The game continues with the knight coming towards the center here. Now, this does block the bishop, but it threatens the push of this pawn backed up by the other pawn and the knight as well. So here I decide to play bishop to f5 to kind of fight for that square. The computer doesn't like this move. So before that, it says if I would have played c5 instead of this bishop, that black would actually have an advantage here. And a lot of times, if you can press the d pawn forward, but the knight is preventing me from pushing the e pawn into the center, then it's often a good idea to push the other pawn, the c pawn, up here beside the centralized d pawn, so that you would have both of these pawns towards the center here, controlling a lot of real estate. All right, the game continues with g3, so getting ready to fianchetto the bishop and probably castle kingside. The game continues with c6. Now the computer states that this is the best move. Why did I play this? Well, to fortify the d pawn. But now that I know this bishop is probably going to wind up here, it'll aim down towards my queen side. So I played c6 to kind of limit the scope of that bishop. The bishop will just hit these pawns, this wall of pawns, and be kind of stuck. I mean, maybe this can press forward, but then the c6 pawn will limit the scope of that bishop. All right, so the bishop does fianchetto, and now we've transposed into the King's Indian attack Yugoslav variation. So that just shows how different moves and series of moves, you can start with one opening and just transpose and change into a completely different opening. So you have to be aware of that when you're deciding what openings to use, because you can use that to make it tougher on your opponent by steering the game into a different opening that they're not familiar with and you are, but then you also have to watch out that they don't do that to you. All right, the knight is developed towards the center, backing up the other knight, covering this e5 square in case the knight wants to jump there in the future. And now we have castling on the king side. And I go ahead and push this pawn up to e6, creating a strong triangle formation here, which will be tough for my opponent to break through. Also, now I can develop my bishop to either e7 or d6. The game continues with a3 here. So maybe getting ready to gain some space on the queen side over here. Now, one thing to mention, we see that white is fianchettoed here, and the pawn is on g3. So often it can be better, instead of putting your bishop here where it just is not doing much, aimed at that wall of pawns here, it might be better to just place your bishop on e7. That'll also handle any possibility of maybe a pin on the knight to the queen. You can just place that bishop on e7 and prevent any pins. All right, I press forward here to prevent a possible push of that b pawn. The game continues with the b pawn just pushing to b3, and we'll have a double fianchettoed position. So I bring my bishop up, like I said, to e7, and this also, once they fianchetto, they'll be aimed at my bishop. It kind of helps protect, or it'll be his bishop will be aimed at my knight, and that'll help defend it. All right, we have the rook centralizing, and the game continues with castling, and finally an attack on the pawns in the center. The computer says that's a good move, but e4 would have been better. So let's see how things continue. The game is pretty even at the moment. I just develop my queen, connect my rooks, so now I'll be able to have an option of where I want to place these rooks. The computer says that queen move was good, but better would have been h6, which would give my knight, well, not my knight, my bishop, an escape hatch. The king could have an escape hatch possibly in the endgame, so there aren't any back rank mate threats. So the game continues with bishop fianchettoing, aiming down through the center and towards my king side. So I decide to centralize my rook, and now we have a breakout here in the center where both pawns are attacking. So it looks like the best move to keep black slightly ahead is to go ahead and capture that e-pawn, which is what I did. And then after the recapture, which is best, capturing with the pawn, because now my bishop is under attack. It looks like bishop to g6 would have been better. And yes, I have to agree with that. I could have gotten rid of my bad bishop for one of these knights. But instead, I go back here. Now the computer recommends that that bishop to g6 retreat is best. And that's probably because the the computer usually prefers that you keep your bishop pair and not give it up unless you have a good reason. So if I would have pushed to g4 up here and exchanged off my bishop for the knight, that would have relieved my cramped position. It would have gotten rid of a bad bishop, which was blocked by all these pawns of mine on the light squares. But my opponent would be left with his bishop pair, and that could be an advantage, especially if the game opens up later. All right, the pawn push here. And this knight is looking like it could get in trouble, so I have to be careful. I have to go bishop to g4, and the computer says that's the only move that keeps a slight edge with black here. So now we have h3, which is best, chasing that knight back to the edge here in the corner. Not a very good spot for that knight. And the best move here is g4, threatening to attack that knight, also preventing the knight from jumping back to f5 and getting back into the game. So a mistake was played here. And looks like this is the first mistake of the game. Knight to e4. So black has an edge after this. But let's see. What do they recommend? Yes, g4. It looks like g4 was a better move. Perhaps my opponent didn't want to play that, thinking it might open up his king side a little bit. But it would restrict that knight kind of keep that knight out of play. So now we have this move, knight up to the center on e4. And here I exchanged the knight off with my bishop because I was thinking, well, that knight could jump in here, onto this outpost. That's a possibility, and I wanted to avoid that. So it looks like my best move would be what? Knight up to c5 to attack the knight. Rook at e to d8, moving this rook, because if the knight jumps into that outpost, it would be attacking my rook on e8. But instead, I just get rid of that bishop. Now, black is still ahead, but that was an inaccuracy. So now the game is a little bit closer because my opponent has the bishop pair and I do not. And then I have this really bad knight kind of out here on the edge of the board. The rook recaptures. And now we have centralizing of my other rook. I thought, well, I'll line up on his queen. Computer says that's an inaccuracy that totally gives away any edge that I had. And it would have been much better to just immediately jump my knight up to c5 and target the rook here. So the queen steps out of the potential line of fire by my rook. And now we have the knight jumping forward, attacking. So rook retreats all the way back, getting ready to reposition and fight for this open d file. So now we have the knight pressing forward. And I did this because if you do not have the bishop pair and your opponent does, a lot of times it's good to try and knock out one of their bishops. So I thought, well, I'll fork the rook and the bishop here, and I'll be able to knock out that bishop. So the rook centralizes, which is best. I take out their bishop, which the computer says that is a great move. Now, I don't know if it was a great move, but it's just a logical move to follow through with my plan of getting rid of his bishop pair. So more exchanges occur here. I'm left with the rook on the open file. The queen recaptures. And now it looks like the best move would have been to jump my knight up here. Now, where could the knight go? If I jump my knight up to f5, where is it going after that? Well, if it's attacked immediately, I guess I could jump over here and fork their bishop and their knight. So their knight would probably capture, my bishop would recapture, and I would get rid of my bad knight. But instead, I play this longer plan, which probably was not best. So here, the queen moves back towards the center, and the computer states that this is a mistake, that b4 would have been better, which probably would have allowed me to trade off, and then after the pawn recaptures, the rook would have an open a file over here. All right, so the game continues with g6. So my plan was possibly to move my knight back here, potentially bring my king up here, but we'll see what happens. Computer says that's an inaccuracy. Once again, I should have just immediately played knight up to f5. So the rooks are opposing one another, and this is a blunder, apparently. And excuse me. So we have a blunder. Why is this a blunder? Well, because I can exchange rooks and then pick off an unprotected pawn over here on a3. So the computer recommends immediately picking off that unprotected pawn. But instead, I decide to capture the rooks first, and that is a little bit of an inaccuracy because now after the queen recaptures, the queen is kind of controlling the open D file instead of my queen. If white would have captured my rook and then my queen recaptured, well, then I would have ended up on the open file. So here I go after that pawn. The queen steps forward, keeping an eye on my pawn. But at the moment, it's guarded by the queen. Now we have, also, I should have mentioned, the queen stepped forward here because it was eyeing my knight. So my king is forced to protect that knight. Otherwise, I would have had to jump my knight up, but then the queen could have moved down here. Oh, I guess not if I move my knight up to f5. But at this point, the computer says that king to g7 is the best move. So the game continues with the queen stepping forward with the possible threat here of just placing the queen up to f6, targeting my king. But I think I would be okay, especially when my bishop can drop back and chase that queen away. All right, what do we have going on now? Computer actually likes g4 better here, which once again would restrict my knight, but I already planned to bring my knight back to g8, which is probably not the best square, but we'll see what happens. I first drop the bishop back to prevent any threats by the queen attacking my king, and the pawns start pressing forward. So I drop the knight back, and inaccuracy, queen to d7, grabbing the open D file would have been better. And here come the pawns. The computer states that this is an inaccuracy, that it would have been better to move the knight to d2, and probably from there it could jump forward and threaten to grab the outpost here on d6. So I press my pawns forward to counter his pawns. We have an exchange. And here I decide to trade off pieces because if you're ahead in material, I have a pawn majority over here. It's usually good to trade off the pieces and then use your extra pawn to promote in the endgame, which that's my plan. So the queen recaptures. And now the best move here, and it looks like it would have been better to capture with the pawn instead, which would limit the scope of my knight. But, that knight is probably heading to e7 anyway. So now, this is an inaccuracy. The computer prefers queen up to b6, targeting this pawn, which would probably force my opponent to drop back to defend it. But here we trade off queens. That is a mistake. Apparently, bishop to f1 would have been better, repositioning that bishop. Because now we have the queens traded off, and my passed pawns are going to run up the board. Well, my pawn majority, I should say, when I create a passed pawn. All right. Bishop centralizes, and my king starts moving to the center, but it would have been better to just immediately push forward here. So we have the king. Now remember, you always want to try and activate your king when you get into the endgame because there are not many pieces on the board. So here I push forward. The computer actually prefers knight to f5. So, that's kind of interesting. I guess that would have allowed, if there was an exchange, which that would not be good for my opponent because it's going to be hard to stop these pawns over here. So here we go. We have an exchange. Now I have a passed A pawn, or I will have one here after I press it forward. Now, if you have a pawn majority, if we go back, we have a 2 versus 1 pawn majority. Generally, you want to push the unopposed pawn. So I'll push this forward, and then if he captures, I can recapture. Now, sometimes you would push the other pawn to stop this pawn, and then you can push the A pawn. So if I push this pawn forward right here, it blocks his B pawn. Then I could push my A pawn. If they capture, then my B pawn would run up the board. But because there's still a bishop on the board, I don't want to do that. So instead, I just play this, and the computer says that's best. And at this point, it looks like I'm winning at this point. All right, so capture, recapture, and the passed pawn is going to be unstoppable here. You can block, but now we have the knight jumping up here to help the pawn. And what do you do now? Black is completely winning. So the bishop cannot even stay there, and it can't block, or we'll just capture it. And according to the computer, the best move may be h5, or pushing the f pawn. But if you're going to lose this bishop, I guess the only other option is to put the bishop on d3, where it can't be attacked. But the computer also recommends giving up the bishop for the two pawns. So we have capture, recapture, king captures, and now white has a passed pawn over here on the h file. But there's not enough time to bring that pawn forward. And I guess I could have maneuvered my king over here to get in front of that pawn and stop it. But I decide to push forward here. The computer actually likes knight to d5. And here comes that passed pawn. So I just ignore that, promote my own pawn. The pawn is running up the board, but it's too late because my knight, by moving here, is really blocking the available squares along with this pawn, and the white king will be trapped. So check, the king runs, and we have a mate. So that's how the game ended. Let's take a look at what the computer says the accuracy rating was. Now, my opponent played with 79.3% accuracy, which was not bad, and we see that the first third of the game was pretty much equal. White even had a slight advantage at multiple points. Almost the first half of the game was about equal. So my opponent played 79.3% accuracy. It looks like I played at a 91.4% accuracy. We both had one great move, 4 inaccuracies by my opponent. But I had 8 inaccuracies, so I could have done better on some multiple moves. But 3 mistakes by my opponent and 1 blunder. Now, according to the rating that we played, it looks like my opponent played at a 1950 rating level, and that I played at 2450. Now, my opponent was a under 1,000 player over the board. So, I think he played fairly well here. He just had that major blunder that gave up a pawn. So, that's what the game came down to. Anyway, we had 97.2% opening accuracy played by my opponent. And I played with 95.4% accuracy. So my opponent played the opening better than I did. And then 81.2 in the middle game, whereas I had 90.3. So I did a little bit better in the middle game and the end game. In the end game, I had 90% accuracy, and my opponent had 57% accuracy. So, my opponent did not too bad. They just kind of had a few missteps in the middle game and the end game. So my recommendation would be, keep trying to improve, work on your middle game and end game play, and you'll climb up the rating bracket. All right, so we have interesting game. I recommend, as always, that you go over your own games by yourself first, and or with a friend that you played or whoever you played against. That's even better. But only then use the computer to see what you missed. All right, feel free to leave comments. I always enjoy hearing from viewers and subscribers. Like and subscribe to support the channel if you haven't already. Thank you for watching and have a super chess day.